It's good to see a nice mixed group of people here today, everything from babies to baby boomers and beyond. So welcome, all of you. I hope you have a good time today. Anyway, our speaker today is Jared Barnes. He's a graduate student here at NC State University. He's a native of Tennessee, and he was raised in a family that loved gardening and horticulture and outdoors and plants. And as a result, he developed a love for horticulture and got a degree, a BS degree in environmental biology from the University of Tennessee at Martin. He then came to North Carolina, across the mountains, and received a master's degree in Department of Horticulture Science and Plant Nutrition. And he's currently now working on a PhD here at NC State in the same department. He's had numerous horticultural jobs in the past, including an internship at Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania. He enjoys hiking and photography, and lately garden writing. He's had a piece in Carolina Gardening recently. In his travels around the world, he's seen a lot of gardens. So he's here today to talk to us about gardens that he's seen, and the title of his talk is Inspiration for Your Landscape from Around the World. Now, Jared aspires to be a teacher one day, so he's handed out an evaluation. He'd like to be evaluated as if we were teaching you today, so if you don't mind taking a few minutes and filling it out at the end and passing it to him, I guess, right? Yes. Please welcome Jared Barnes. Thank you.
And I want to thank all of you for inviting me here today to speak. It's really an honor. I tell you what, it's been a busy, busy week because I just gave 3 talks over at Green and Growing this week. So this is number 4, and so I'm happy to round up the week by talking with you. Like Bobby said, the evaluation form is just sort of making sure that I'm communicating effectively what you want to learn from this talk, and so I appreciate any feedback that you're willing to give too. And there's also a handout, and I hope everyone got one of those as well. So, all right, so I have a claim, and that claim is that I think that all of you are plants. Now that might seem sort of crazy, and I hope none of you are offended by that. I'm not trying to say that you all look green or anything, but this whole idea comes from, observing plants and watching them, that, when plants are in the right environment and they're given the right resources, they grow. And I think, we gardeners are very, very similar, that when we are in the right environment, when we are given the right resources, when we subscribe to gardening magazines, or when we go and visit gardens, or when we come and listen to these people talk who are, full of all this hot air and everything, we can learn a lot from them. We can learn a lot by seeing things. And I also think that, sort of continue this, biologically crazy idea that we as people are plants, that, plants, biologically speaking, can also have relationships with each other. They can have symbioses, you can even have parasitism as well. And so why can't we gardeners share ideas with each other? Why can't we communicate and sort of pass ideas along? And so that's where this whole idea of this talk, Rambling Roots, comes from. Is people who explore the world, people who look around the earth, trying to soak up all this knowledge and all these really interesting plants and things, and sort of then coming back and sharing those things with more people so that they can then help them to grow as gardeners. So that's the premise behind today's talk, and I hope you'll enjoy it as we travel around the world looking at some great gardens, some great plants, and we'll have a lot of fun along the way. So first off, if we're going to talk about rambling roots, we need to talk about my roots first. And I grew up originally in Tennessee. For me, this is home. It's flat. A lot of times whenever I tell people I'm from West Tennessee, they say, oh, the mountains. And I'm like, no, our biggest mountain is like, 5 feet tall. But this is the photograph from in front of my house. I was very, very fortunate to grow up in a rural area. I could walk around and look for wildflowers like Erythronium albidum. This one was a little bit more rare in our area, I was told by one of my native plant friends back in Tennessee. Another thing is horticulture has been a part of my life or a part of my family's life for a while. Not necessarily the fact that, they were growers of plants, or, they went out and studied, researched plants or anything, but just generally growing plants. This is a tulip that my great-grandmother planted back in 1969. And it's still growing. I was able to go out and collect it in her yard. I actually think it's a form of Tulipa praecox, but I just sort of named it collectively as Mary Lee, and I think it's one of the most beautiful tulips that I've seen, just because it's got so much family history to it as well. Now, Whenever I was younger, I was 15 years old, and my mom would drive me to the Master Gardener class every week so that I could be able to learn more about plants. And man, working with some of these people was really kooky. One year we did this whole plant doctor scheme where, we had people bring in their troubled plants, and then we sort of staged this shot where we had all these plant doctors standing around this sick plant. But it was a lot of fun, and from these people I learned a whole lot. Another thing is that as a kid I loved to experiment. One day whenever I was 5 years old, my mom had just planted these nice impatiens out in our front yard. And so I went out and looked at it and was like, I wonder what would happen if I came out here and sprayed soap on one of these. And of course, being the good scientist that I was, I sprayed soap on one side, and I did not spray soap on the other side for control. And the side that got the soap spraying, guess what happened? They died, yeah. And guess what happened to my behind? Yeah, it was a little bit bruised. But that experimental nature continued as I grew up because I started looking for all these weird and different ways to do gardening. Like, for example, using soil blocks instead of pots to raise seedlings in. And so then I would start transplants in these, pot them up, and by 6 weeks I had tomatoes that were flowering. And I had tomatoes oftentimes fruiting before the first day of summer, which that was an incredible thing to be able to sort of brag to your Master Gardener friends about. Another thing that really piqued my interest from an early childhood is this whole idea of season extension. Couldn't get enough of gardening. The fact that winter comes along means that I'm not ready to shut down. And so I started building cold frames. I built a straw bale cold frame and even figured out that you need to put wire on top of it to keep the dog out. I then graded up and built wooden ones. And then next thing you know, I'm building hoop houses that can withstand an 8-inch snow that we crazy got one Christmas. And then they get taller and taller until finally I built a 16 by 24 foot greenhouse in our front yard. Folks, if you want to test if your parents love you, ask them if you can put up a giant igloo in your front yard. Okay, that's the road there. The house is behind me, so everyone goes by and sees this thing out there. But it was a joy to be able to do this. I was able to grow spinach from September to April. No heat whatsoever. I think that this is totally an underutilized thing that we as gardeners don't capitalize on. This winter gardening. Basically, the plants will survive. It survived a couple nights at 12 degrees. No problem. Just took it and kept on growing. Inside, we've got spinach, beets, cabbages, another layer of protection there for some things that liked it a little bit warmer. Another thing that I really struggled with growing up in a rural area was just sort of seeing the abuse that the land got. A lot of times along these roadways and stuff, they would just erode to nothing. I've actually climbed down in this ditch and stood head level with the road, and it's very, very sad. And then just sort of seeing the trash and stuff. And so I'm constantly trying to think of ways that I can help this and that I can try to help fix this problem that we have across the roadsides. Please, come up and talk to me afterwards about any ideas that you might have for things. A lot of people influenced me in my youth. One of my good friends was Jimmy Williams, and he lived in Paris, Tennessee. And this was his front yard in the summertime. And that's a street right there behind it. So I love how he's come in and created this sort of like English garden effect where you don't see the street. And then even in the wintertime, it looks absolutely spectacular. His garden was so nice that Fine Gardening decided to do a piece on him. So they came and they photographed. He told me they climbed up on top of the roof and shot all these photographs of areas like the pastel garden. And then on the back side of his house, he has this nice red border where he's tried to incorporate a lot of warm colors into it to provide a lot of summer seasonal interest. Another thing as far as the season extension goes is that Jimmy really picked up on with me is that these winter flowering plants, sort of trying to figure out a way to extend the season, grow as much as you can. And he tried to have a plant in his garden flowering every week of the year. And he was able to do this with like Commanathus praecox, the Prunus autumnalis, Suppertella variety autumnalis. And then believe it or not, that he had the first, I know this is commonplace for all of you, but he had one of the first Prunus mumis I've ever seen in my entire life. And talking with him back over Christmas, he said that they are still struggling to get them into the area. No one knows about it. It hasn't really been introduced that far west, so maybe we sort of need to have a pioneer push of plants. Another thing he really enjoyed doing was creating these hypertufa troughs. occasionally he and his grandson, whom he brags about, is a 300-pound football player, would go out and pick up all this rough old concrete on the sides of roads. And occasionally he would even go as far as building his own, just right there sort of in the garden, using cement and rocks to put this together. So really a clever, crafty guy. Really harped on drainage about the Hypertufa. That's why he used it a lot. Now, Jimmy was a very, very eclectic sort of person. As you can see for his shirt saying garden is therapy for a dirty mind. He sort of enjoyed entertaining his guests by taking them around to his voodoo room, where he had a lot of skulls and skeletons and just sort of really weird old signs and stuff. So, very, very interesting guy. At UT Gardens Jackson, my friend Jason Reeves has done a lot with really, really crazy ideas. He did this annual vines one year where he took all these weird old crafty things and hung up these vines like these bicycles. And the guy, he's brilliant. One year he did a cooking with succulents thing, and I was like, good night, Jason. You've got muffin pans, you've got an oven, you've got a mixer. I said, you've got everything in here except the kitchen sink. And he was like, oh no, I've got that too. So really, really crafty guy. And then Halloween, the fall season, is one of his favorite times of the year. And so he comes in and puts these scarecrow shirts up. He does these elaborate pumpkin displays too. Just absolutely incredible what he's able to do with, typically you see pumpkins at the farmer's market just sort of laid out, and I think you could even do something like this at your home on a much, much smaller scale. Truly inspirational. He had some really unique plants there, like the crown flower, the calotropis, and I love, the flowers on this thing look almost fake. It's incredible, and the broad, nice foliage. And then, of course, erythrina as well, too. He had one of the first plants that I'd ever seen of this. He had seeds sent to him from New Zealand for it, but I absolutely love that red color of the flower. Another great place in Tennessee that I visited, actually since I've been to North Carolina, is Don Shadow's nursery. And if you know anything about Don, he's not only a wonderful, wonderful plantsman, but he's also an eclectic collector of these weird and interesting animals. The day that we showed up, he told us that the night before, this beautiful, beautiful tapir had just been born. And so they had to go out in the middle of the night and get this special food for it. You're driving along with Don, and all of a sudden look out in the field, and there's zebras on one side and camels on another, and he just collects all these really, really interesting animals. And not only is he a lover of animals, but he's also a great plantsman. He even took us back into his chain-locked part of the nursery to show us some of his more interesting pieces. Like this Oryxia. I love the foliage of that. And then, of course, he also had some interesting plants like Pygmea that you find growing sort of down in the southern swamps. A little bit faded flowers there, but I definitely thought it was worth putting in here to mention it. Now, we're driving along, and all of a sudden, Don sort of stops and pulls off the side of the road, and he says, there's a lot of nice trees and stuff growing out. And he says, boy, get out and go out over there and break off that branch. And so, of course, when Don Shadow tells you to do something, you get out and do it. So I went over there and broke it off, and he was telling us about how Catinus is called yellowwood because of the fact that when you break it, it has yellow on the inside. And so just sort of having a day with this great plantsman and learning a lot from him was really, really great. Even things about common natives that we take for granted. Like Bobby, whenever he introduced me, I spent a couple of months up at Swarthmore College, and that truly had a wonderful impact on my life, just being able to spend a summer up there in Swarthmore and the whole Philadelphia region, where you're able to see great gardens. And of course, one of the plants up there that many of you will recognize is, of course, Cartilage wine. They just have massive specimens of it as well. One of the new plants that I saw up there was this Venus cornus. It's got, look, I put my hand up there to give it not only a thumbs up, but you a reference for the size too. And my friend Aaron Shetler over at Meredith, he's told me that he's growing this as well. It's doing well for him, and the flowers each year keep getting bigger and bigger. And then, of course, some of these other plants like Ogon, I just love how that venation is set off in that leaf by that nice chartreuse color. Other plants I learned about up there, of course, many of you know the story about Franklinia, the fact that Bartram went and collected some of the old seeds that we now have plants from. And so being able to be on campus where it has so much history imbued with it was really great. The clematises, they had a lot of clematises that they had taken and planted, not only on trees and shrubs, but just for instance, like Gushi, Cainensis, lemon bells, and then Texensis is one of my absolute favorites, and I think some of these would do well for you in your rock gardens. The green roofs up there's been a big push for green roofs, and actually Jeff Jabko is coming down in February to give a talk for the graduate students on the work that he's done in Swarthmore. But just being able to see the green roofs go in these early stages to the finished product like this is absolutely spectacular, what they've been able to do up there. And so really, really great. I highly recommend a trip up there at any point in time. This was taken in May, and anywhere from May to June is sort of a good time to go and see these green roofs and flower. Now, one thing is that they had a few people want to get out on the green roofs and, do some partying and stuff, and so unfortunately they can't really get the kids in trouble up there, and so they just sort of have to hang up these signs that's like, we're going to tell you very forcibly not to do this, but we really can't really do much about it except fine you $50. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Georgia is a state I've been to a couple of times, and recently the most impressive thing that I've seen there is Gibbs Gardens. To be able to go there in the spring and see these daffodils in flower. I remember the day that my mom called me. She called me and she said, Jared, I said, hey Mom. She said, I've got a garden for you to go to. I said, oh really? I said, where is it? She said, it's down in Georgia. It's Gibbs Gardens. She said, Southern Living's done a write-up about it, and it is absolutely spectacular. I tell you what, Southern Living could write an article about like a landfill, and I think my mom would want to go there. So. But eventually, she and Dad were able to work it out so that they could come down and go with me. And man, was this spectacular! This was opening weekend, and I told them, I said, we've got to get there early because the line's going to be out the wazoo. I've been to Longwood and everywhere else. How all these people get crazy, and we get there. And there's 3 cars in the parking lot, and mine's one of them. So we had the entire place to ourselves for an hour, hour and a half, and just being able to look at the color echo. Look at the color echo in the daffodil there and in that beach leaves. Just absolutely spectacular. And look at how he's been able to creatively place those daffodils where you see them mirrored in the water. Of course, Mom and Dad pose them at the shot with the daffodils. And I have never seen my dad take so many pictures of flowers in his life. He was taking photographs and sending them to his sister and everything else. So really being able to share horticulture with my parents has been a true joy for me. And then that was the hillside over there that I showed you earlier. And it just goes on and on forever. Absolutely spectacular. Incredible. It's just north of Atlanta. They have a Chinese garden there as well too, where he's done a lot of sort of incorporation of these things that you think are fairly common, like the Acorus, but then he comes in and puts this nice river of them, and it looks absolutely spectacular. Brilliant landscape design. Massachusetts. I wanted to briefly show you something that I saw in Massachusetts this summer, and that was at the Harvard Museum of Natural History. And they have an incredible collection of plants there, except get this, the plants are all made of glass. They have hundreds and hundreds of these plants that are there and on display. You can go in and look at them. I mean, just look at the detail of some of these. It's absolutely fascinating. Cacti, glass. Every bit of it's glass. Acer rubrum, glass. So if you're ever in the Massachusetts area, I highly recommend going and checking out the exhibits that they have there. Spectacular. All right, next up, let's go international. Singapore. Singapore was a very long flight. In fact, Bobby, I bought your book and read it pretty much all the entire way there. So it was
another trip.
Yeah, there you go. Right. China's calling. You never know. But it was 12 hours from Minneapolis to Japan, and then another 7 down to Singapore. So, but what's really cool is getting up, stretching your legs, looking out over Canada and the coast of Russia, and seeing all this ice and snow. It's absolutely spectacular. Now, when you're from a rural area and you tell your parents and your other friends and stuff that you're going to Singapore, there's a little bit of concern. And not only that, but there's also concern that was coming from Raleigh, because I had people telling me, they said, Jared, You're going to go over there, you're going to meet a cute Asian girl, you're going to fall in love, and you're going to get married or bring her back with you. I was like, please. I said, I'm only going to be over there for a week. It's not going to be that easy. Well, I get to Singapore, and the first thing I see is this. And I'm like, wow, this is going to be a whole lot easier than I thought it was going to be. But this is a little exhibit they had at the Singapore Art Museum, and so just some of the signage that they have was very, very interesting. You know, some was very welcoming, some was a little more, let's say, hostile. So. And then I was also really happy to see a friend of mine from the southeast. I was like, yes, camouflage. I could probably walk up and talk to this guy. But one thing that was interesting about Singapore is that they've made this huge push about turning sort of this city and making the slogan that it's a city within the garden. And so the minute you get off the plane, there's plants. You look at walls, there's plants. You look in trees, there's plants. In the middle of the road, the intersection, plants. A casino that they haven't finished building yet. Plants. I mean, everywhere you look, there's plants. It's absolutely incredible. And another really cool thing is to go to, you're in the tropics when you walk around outside and you're like, oh, I've seen that in the greenhouse before. And then when you also round the corner and you're like, oh, they have a greenhouse except instead of being heated, it's being cooled. So I thought that was really interesting. You go in and they sort of have this nice foggy mist. They have to keep it a little bit cooler for some of these plants that like it a little bit more higher altitude. The plants there were massive, like this Coco del Mer, the Laodicea malvavica. I mean, just one of those leaves could fall and crush me. And then the trunks of some of these trees is absolutely spectacular. Unfortunately, I didn't have a tripod or anything to sort of give you perspective. But then when you see the roots of this tree, you sort of really begin to gain perspective of the size. This is a Sevia. So absolutely incredible. Other really interesting plants like the Sriracha were in full flower then whenever I was there. It's interesting sort of how their bloom time patterns are off because that's more of a tropical area as well. And once we spent time in Singapore, we went out for a brief stint into Malaysia. And so some of the people on the trip were Muslim, and so they had to stop for the Friday prayers. And so I started walking around looking at plants, of course. Well, they had Crape myrtles in Malaysia, and they were absolutely spectacular. But you really don't get an appreciation of the size of the flower until you see it in my hand. This is Langstroemia speciosa. So wouldn't it be great if we could get some of those like interbred with some of our more hardier plants that we grow here? And then of course, other really cool plants like the traveler's palm, just planted around this mosque in large areas. Really, really spectacular to see these. But it was sort of an interesting dichotomy of life to go from this beautiful city in Putrajaya up into the more mountainous areas where people were living out of shacks and shanties. And so it was sort of an interesting dichotomy to see life there. Really, some interesting plants. The more and more I learn about thymbergias, I'm falling more in love with them. This one here, the way that those are hanging down across that arbor, I mean, just absolutely spectacular. And then it was really, really fun to see tea. Sweet tea is one of my favorite plants. And of course, you can grow it here in the southeast. It's a great plant. Durr brags and raves about it in his book as well. And then to see Singapore lit up at night, that was a really, really nice end of the trip for that trip to Singapore. Now that same year, I went to England. And I never will forget whenever Bryce Lane started talking about the England trip because I was trying to get the grad students to do some trips and stuff like that. And then I went to a horticulture club and he started talking about England and I was like, I am sold. I will do whatever you want, man. You just take me with you. One thing I didn't say about Singapore was that I was actually awake the entire trip. I stayed awake 34 hours. And so I was going to England. I was so excited to go to England. I almost fell asleep, but then I saw the sun start peeking above the horizon. I was like, no, there's no chance. And beginning to get over the countryside and see these beautiful fields of canola was really, really nice to see all of this. The way that the British really try to incorporate horticulture in their life is, I think, it's spectacular. It's truly inspirational. I would get up every morning early before everyone else would and walk around and try to see as much of the city as I could. We were staying at Bath at this point, but they have this hanging basket here, and they actually have automatic irrigation going into the pots. So, they sort of don't have to take care of this. and to see sort of some of these underground little patio areas there where they've got a lot of interesting plants as well. And even some people were just growing out of these grow bags. So it was almost like anywhere that they could try to stick a plant, they would try to do that. Fun was had by all. You know, occasionally later in the evening, whenever it gets almost too dark to photograph plants, you got to go out and just sort of ride the merry-go-rounds. And another thing that we really struggled with in England was that there was a lot of potheads on the street. But the Wisley Gardens were really, really nice, and I put this in here for y'all because I know that as rock gardeners, y'all would appreciate some of these plants in here and stuff, like the Roscovias, other really interesting rock garden plants too. This is one from New Zealand, the Bubblemellinia. And then this is one that I really thought was interesting, the black foliage on it. It's absolutely incredible. This is Chloranthus. I looked up the form online, and the common form is green, but this one I think is probably domino. So it's got a nice black foliage to it. Really stood out there. And then just to see these massive plantings here of alliums. It was really, really inspirational. I'm like, oh, I wish we could do this more in the U.S. Sometimes allium struggle, or this type of allium struggles for us a little bit more. Tuna, the flamingo. I mean, man, whenever you see a pink tree, it captures your attention like nothing else. I mean, absolutely incredible. And here's the question: how fast do y'all think this will cook for us? A day or so? I think it would probably cook faster than an Irish baby in the full sun. So, Bath had a botanic garden as well. And it was really nice to walk around and see some of these interesting plants like this Labernosticis, that plant where I think it was 1825 where they grafted the two together, and somehow their genetics got meshed together, and so you can actually get both plants sort of chimeering out on this same plant. It's really interesting. And then to even be able to see some of our native plants like Magnolia acuminata growing with sort of lower branches so that you can get up and closely be able to appreciate some of these more intricate flowers. It was really nice to be able to walk around. This is the best garden that I think I've been to in the world. So just sort of preparing y'all for what you're about to see. This is Best Chateau's garden. It's definitely one of the top three. But I went there because several of my friends had said that they've been there. It was absolutely spectacular. And then all my friends who were on the trip, they wanted to go and do a day in London. And I was like, I'm going to go see what people say is one of the best gardens in the world. So I went there, and some of the color combinations that she did were so simple and so elegant. I mean, we could do this. We could do this here in Raleigh. And they say that people who have mastered something can do it well and make it look easy. Well, any pairing that she did, color combo-wise, it seems so simple and so easy. Like the poppies here with the purple sage in the background, or even occasionally coming in and planting mullein in the middle of the bed. Just sort of kind of creates some interest there. Euphorbia griffithii, Dixter, one of my favorite plants from the entire trip. Any of these plants that have these nice hot colors I instantly fall in love with. And then another plant that I really enjoyed seeing in her garden was Nectora scordum. And this is one that I've tried in a container last year. Did fairly well, but man, I just love seeing those little sort of arching chandeliers of flowers. Really nice. And here, again, backed by berberis. I mean, how easy is that? Asphodelphus. And then Dictamnus as well. Are people familiar with this plant? The gas plant, the burning bush, where if you take a little match and put it in one of the stalks, it all of a sudden goes like, you should go on YouTube and look up videos of it. It's pretty cool to see this plant. Right. I mean, you can just stand there all day, just like amazed and stuff. One night when you're out barbecuing with your friends, be like, hey, I got something to show you. And then here we've got this nice color combination again, just absolutely electric, some of these. Canada. We went to Canada for a conference and then hopped over to Calgary for some of my friends getting married. And so we went up to Lake Louise, and there's a couple in the room who went with me as well too. But to be able to experience the Rockies is an absolutely amazing thing, especially for someone who comes from flatland Tennessee. And then get up and hike. Some of my friends were kidding that I basically had the camera glued to my face, but I was trying to capture as much of this landscape as I possibly could. So we hiked from Lake Louise up to this little tea cottage here. And what really fascinated me was that there's ice on the ground, yet here they have a little calibracoa hanging up here. So they have to pack stuff up by donkeys, and occasionally they have to fly things in via helicopter because it's so far up in the mountains. Now you know you're in Canada when it's June 19th and there are daffodils in flower. Yeah, the last day of spring, daffodils still in flower. And then some other interesting plants that I saw while I was there was pussy willow for the first time in the wild. Love those little flowers, very colorful. And then some other ones too, like this trolleus. And then this anemone here too. So really nice, just sort of trying to come up and emerge from the snow. This one was interesting because there were shrubs, there were little low-growing shrubs. And so underneath some of these shrubs, these little flowers were there. And so I don't know if these shrubs gave it sort of more protection from snow and ice, or if they sort of kept moose and other, animals like squirrel, away. You never know. Another trip internationally that I did was to Switzerland. Switzerland was an absolutely great trip and really left an impression on me just because of the presence of the Alps. Seeing some of the horticulture there, like this flower bridge in Lucerne, the giant hydrangeas that were there, and of course, again, it seems like everywhere you go, swings want to attract people of all ages. The Zurich Botanic Garden was one of the highlights of the trip just because of the types of plants that were there and everything. So this is a photograph that I took in 2012. This is a photograph that J.C. Ralston took in 1981. Whenever I was getting ready for the trip, I looked at his photograph. I was looking through his photograph slide, and sure enough, whenever I got there, I was like, oh, I recognize these two. I've seen this before. So I thought I'd put that little tidbit in there that it was kind of touching that even after 30 years, going back and sort of being in the same place that he had once been was definitely an interesting experience. Edelweiss, of course, famous from the musical The Sound of Music. They took here and planted it in the shape of the Swiss cross and then surrounded it with the red verbena. And then just a close-up of it in one of the little raised beds that they had there as well too. So trying to show people the different types of plants that grow in different parts of Switzerland at the Botanic Garden. Galtonia, I know that this does well for Adrian and then over at the Paul J. Ciener Botanic Garden. And then being able to see some of these other nice plants like Echinops flowering and doing well in this environment. Really, really nice Botanic Garden. We took a day trip over to Austria where we stopped at the Innisbruck University Botanic Garden, checked out some of the cool plants there. How about this for a security system? Isn't that an awesome idea? Yeah, just right underneath that overhang, you barely have to water it. You don't have those people on television being like, if you don't get a security system, you're in deep trouble. So much more effective than that. Love these patternings on some of these wood-bee hives that they had there at the garden. And then pokeweed. I did ever think that I'd say that I'd like a pokeweed, but they had this more ornamental form there. It comes from the Alps region and European region. So yeah, really nice. I've cut down hundreds of these things out in the rural parts. One thing that was really, really touching about the whole region was that they had these cemeteries. And you go into these cemeteries and they have made a point to incorporate plants into the tombstones. And they come in and they maintain these, and they keep these up. And I think it's a great tribute that they do to those who have passed on. And just, this is not the only one that we saw, but, here's a lady who's actually going in there and actually carving on the tombstone. And they had this communal water source as well, too. So it said, please don't take me on the watering can. And so people come up, they fill up the watering can, they go about and then work in their gardens. So really, really touching to see how people had incorporated horticulture sort of into the memory of their loved ones. Now we left Switzerland to head down towards Italy. And man, did we ever get in a traffic jam, because evidently we were going down to Italy the exact same weekend that all the Germans get off to go down for their 2-3 week vacation. So we decided to take a little side road. We were an hour behind, and next thing I know, we are basically driving through heaven. Some of these photographs don't do it justice. I'm driving, And so my friends and stuff are taking photographs, but we never got out of the car until we got to sort of a more secluded area. But I got mad at Bryce. I was like, Bryce, you know, we drove through the most beautiful country. So the reason I put this in here is because eventually it'll come back here in a little bit as sort of a hold that it did for me. But when we got to Italy, we visited several of the gardens there. This is overlooking Stresa, down here is Stresa. And here's a couple of the island gardens that I'm going to talk about. This is Isola Madre, and this is Isola Bella. And then over here is Villa Taranto. But being able to sort of have this panoramic view of the countryside is spectacular. This is a hotel, and look, every balcony has the little geraniums. Absolutely incredible. And then impatiens out front, along the side. Of course, they're trying to cater to tourists. Now, has anyone ever, you know, people have heard about Italian meatballs, right? We know about American meatballs here, but you know about Italian meatballs, right? Yeah. So this is where, you know, people talk about how we Americans take these exotic plants and meatball. Well, here's an American southern magnolia. They had taken a meatball themselves, so probably to keep it in control in front of that hotel. But I thought that was definitely sort of an interesting comparison with what we see here. So to get to these gardens that are out on the water, you have to first get on a boat, and then you have to drive out. You have to, or not drive out, but you have to. You drive a boat. Yeah, sure. You drive out. I almost said swim out, but we're not doing that. It's too far. But you go out to these gardens, and some of these are just absolutely incredibly landscaped because of the fact that they're out on the water. Some of these are slightly warmer than the surrounding land around them. This right here is a Cryptomeria Nana. It's over 100 years old. So I think JC was the one who said that, you know, there's no real dwarf plant. Yeah, he's got a really good point about that. Definitely. And then to be able to see some of the students' reactions whenever they see Gunnera for the first time, man, I tell you what, this plant right here, if we could grow this in the U.S., man, we could probably revitalize our entire horticulture industry, at least here in the southeast U.S. Another one of the gardens that we went to is Villa Taranto. This was a great place to go just because of the massive size, a lot of these historic, interesting trees like this umbrella pine. Large trees that were there. And there's one of my friends, Tom, sort of standing for a scale of size. They had a large dahlia collection as well. Some of these you just want to walk up, pick off, and just eat it. They look so luscious. And look at that. Doesn't that look like berries and cream? You know, like those little lifesaver things you get? Man, absolutely incredible. This was one of the plants that I was told to keep my eye out for by Andrew Bunting up at Swarthmore whenever I went. I told him I was going, I was like, you know, hey, what should I check out in the region? He was like, well, if you go to Villa Taranto, make sure that you see the Hymenopterus Henryi. This is one of the first ones that flowered in Europe. I believe it was 1971. So to sort of be able to stand by this historic tree was really, really interesting. And of course, I think the first one flowered here in Raleigh about 10 years ago. So the first one in the United States flowered here in Raleigh a couple years ago. So, and then of course, a few of the flowers are falling on the ground. So my friend Liz put some in her hair. And then of course, you know, you have to put one of the legendary trees, you know, of your life in your hair too. So some of the bark of some of these trees, like this Storia, is absolutely incredible. Just look at that patterning. The massive size of that plant as well. But tragedy did strike Villa Taranto this past year because they had a tornado come through and it took out 300 of the largest, very, very large trees, and so they are slowly recovering for that. So I was I counted myself very fortunate to be able to go there and to see this place in all of its splendor before this terrible thing hit. If you want to, you can, you know, contribute money to them. Whenever I looked up on the website, they were taking donations. So, but very, very sad that this place got hit with such a terrible thing. So last day, again, my friends are talking about where they all want to go, and everyone wants to go to Milan. And I'm like, I want to go back to the Alps. And so I figured out that I could take a train, and then I could get to Brig, which is the city you see here, and I could take a bus, and I could get up to a cable car, and then I could eventually get up and get into the Alps. And so this is how I spent my last free day. I went up into the Alps above the tree line practically and walked out and saw a lot of these interesting plants and wildflowers like fireweed here that you just see growing along the slopes. It's really, really interesting. It was sort of a rush trip, so I didn't have much time to botanize. But to get out and look out over this spectacular view of the Altesh Glacier, it's absolutely incredible, very, very touching. It was almost one of these moments, it's like, oh, I think I've set foot in heaven. Incredible. Little church there, on the countryside as well. And this is sort of a nice spot to round up the international part, because I was standing there admiring this beautiful, beautiful view, and there was this man here standing next to me. He walks up, he looks at me, and he says, that's why vegan Now I'm like, I don't understand a word that you just said. But he held out his camera, and I said, oh yeah, sure, I'll take a photograph. And so he walked over, and I took a photograph of him. And then he did the same for me too. And it was sort of one of these things that, even though we speak different languages, people from different cultures, people from different countries can truly appreciate beautiful things not only in the landscape but in the garden as well too. So I thought that was a nice way to sort of round out that trip, was to have that experience with that man. And then of course I had to get back to Italy quickly so that I could catch the flight the next day. I stayed in North Carolina for the last, mainly just because if I wanted to leave you with anything today, I wanted to leave you with some of these places that you could go on day trips, or maybe things that I've seen here in the state that have truly inspired me and truly made me really enjoy the fact that I've been here for the past 4.5, 5 years. One of the top places that I've enjoyed going to is Gregory Bald. And I remember I found out about Gregory Bald just randomly searching about great places to go to see plants in North Carolina online. And then I started talking to Jason and Tom Rainey and them about going too. And so next thing I knew, they had sort of planned a trip up there so that Kim could do some collecting for the rhododendron species up on top. But to go up and be able to see these plants just sort of like out on this massive ball. I mean, these are everywhere. They're just everywhere in complete, it almost looks like the mountaintop is on fire. It's such a vibrant orange. And then the deer, very, very friendly. They come up, they browse through people's bags. No, I'm just kidding. They weren't that friendly. But, just to be able to get up on top of this bald and see all this beauty was really, really nice. Another trip and place that I've been to that I've really enjoyed going is Stone Mountain in North Carolina. I went there with Kelly and Jason back a couple years ago. You hike up on top of this mountain, and there's these beautiful bonsai pines on top, and these collection of moss and wildflowers, and just sort of the way that the water runs off the top of the mountain. It's almost like an entirely different ecosystem on top. And to be able to go up there and see a lot of the plants was really, really, really nice. And then of course Jason went crazy over the Pionanthus there, just fell in love with it. Another plant that sort of left an impression on me another place that's left an impression on me is the Green Swamp Reserve. And this is down near the coast of North Carolina, and to be able to walk out and see just thousands and thousands of liatris in flower, and to imagine that this is what a lot of our country used to look like, it was absolutely spectacular. I planned this trip because I heard about this plant, or one of the main reasons I planned this trip was because I heard about Marshallia in flower down there, and they said one of the best times to go see it was later in the summer. Of course, little did I know I would also hit it for the peak season of all the flowering orchids, cristata, ciliaris, and then also integral flower. So when you look at the orchid, does anything stand out to you yet? Does anyone see it? Right there. Praying mantis. It was interesting. I would get out and get ready to photograph these flowers, and there would be like a praying mantis just sitting there waiting for something to come along. And then another one, they had these little anoles. And it was like every couple of flowers you came to them. So it was sort of this interesting predator-prey relationship that you were sort of seeing, where you see these animals hiding out on these flowers, just waiting for these little butterflies and bees and stuff to come along. So I thought that was interesting. And then to be able to see some of these plants like Lilium Catesbyii in flower, and then just sort of just enjoy them for how they are growing out there in the pine savanna. Really beautiful. Botanic Garden-wise, the Paul J. Ciener Botanic Garden is one of my favorites in the state, just because I think Adrian is doing some wonderful things out there. This was her salvia border last fall. Just the colors last October. I stopped in whenever I was heading up to the mountains to have a weekend with my family, and the colors here are just absolutely spectacular that you see. And one of the things that, oh shucks, what's his name? Help me out. Yeah, Todd Lassane, thank you. One of the things that Todd Lassane did before he left is he said, I hate these curves that, they're just solid curves, and so he came in here and dug out these little holes before they put them in, so now they've got little succulents growing out. Now folks, I warned the people at Green Grow whenever I showed them in my Tropicals and Annuals talk, this next plant is pretty high. This is Erythrina, so just brace yourself. Don't come rushing up at the screen or anything real quick to just throw yourself on top of it. But man, look at that incredible foliage. Never seen anything like it in the entire plant keep. Absolutely incredible. I was like, man, I want one of these. And you can give me one for Christmas if you want to. Or Valentine's Day, it's closer. I can grow it all summer long. I'm cheap, no problems there. And then, of course, last, I can't give a garden talk here at the J.C. Ralston without talking about what an impact on learning about plants that it's had in my life. I've seen it in the spring. Been very fortunate when snow has covered the entire landscape. Or winter, sorry, it's not spring, it's winter. Or spring, when a lot of the dogwoods are in flower. And then in summer, when a lot of the geophytes start coming into the bloom. And then finally in fall, when a lot of the trees start showing some of their wonderful, wonderful foliage colors. It's one of the first pictures I ever took here. Whenever I flew here to check out the university in April of 2008, and I was like, "Oh my goodness, it's a dogwood with fused bracts. I am coming here." and then to come back and take more photographs of this plant, and yeah, it's crazy. They're all fused, the little sepals. I think I may just call them petals. Sorry about that. The sepals are fused together. So, really interesting plant. And then one of my favorite parts of the entire Arboretum is to come out here in the winter landscape and enjoy a lot of the winter interest from some of these plants like Salix flame and also Vihu maple. And then winter sun, Stiphonolobium, Sephora. Whenever I came here, I had no earthly clue that there was so much potential for winter interest as far as stem color goes. But the J.C. Ralston has taught me a lot about plants and about people. And with that, I'd like to say that the story about North Carolina will continue in May, because I'm also doing a talk for a Friends of the Arboretum lecture in May, and it's going to be about all the travels in North Carolina. So you'll see more about all the places that I've just mentioned, and you'll hear about more of the other great places in the state. So thank you all for coming. Thank you all for your attention today.
Got passed out with 154 slides. It was only going to take 45 minutes. A lot of y'all have probably been to lectures with half this many slides. It took twice that long. So, I also have to say, when you said you went to Singapore and you stayed awake for the entire 34 hours, I thought you went to Singapore and stayed 34 hours.
Oh, no, I stayed the entire week. No coffee, too. How about that, folks?
It was Bobby's book.
Yeah. It was Bobby's book, that's right. It was just like every page, and I was like, and that was another interesting thing that I have to comment on, was to read JC's life story and then go to this entire place that was brand new. I was like, wow, it's incredible, sort of following in his footsteps type of environment. So thank you again, Bobby, for that added experience that I had.
Is there any questions? You're all dumbfounded?
Yes, ma'am.
Who supports those two islands in Italy with those beautiful plants?
A lot of the families, I believe, do, and then also there's a mission to pay going into the islands. They used to be orangeries back in the 1300s. One of them was, I know at least. And then they sort of converted it over to a garden. But I think there's a sort of a rich prince or something that owned the island. And so, yeah, I think that's how it's supported. And then we paid admission for the gardens as well, too. So. Yes, sir.
Where in North Georgia is Gibbs Gardens?
It's near Ball Ground, North Georgia. It's about an hour north of Atlanta. So if you want a really, really nice drive, what I recommend do is instead of going down through Charlotte, to go through Asheville and then go that back country, because a lot of those roadsides in the spring.
You can also
and
go
then,
down 85 to Gainesville, and the highway goes around.
that's true, yeah. But my favorite part of that trip was to drive through the Nantahala in the springtime. Man, that's on my checklist to go back to.